Hello everyone, I am Tacit, and today we shall be continuing going over every single troop in the game to celebrate 1,000 troops, and of course we shall be continuing today with every single rare in the game. So main thing about rares, of course, one comes in with every single new faction that we end up getting. It does have every single bounty troop, as well as one of the first ones right here, one of the bounty troops, so has all those included within it as well, and is definitely a category that gets updated quite a bit more often compared to that of commons. Similar to commons though, there's still quite a few good options that are lower rarity. One pretty nice thing about Gems of War, a lot of really good things at the low rarity end. Not too many good damage sources, but definitely a lot of good mana accumulators. But anyways, let's start going over every single rare. So as far as Acolyte, this used to be a lot better back in the day. It just creates a bunch of brown and gives it to a random stat. Overall, generally going to be useless. It used to be used a little bit for its necromancy. However, in the current state of the game, there's so many better things that you'd basically never really touch it, because there's better things for souls and there's better things for brown mana accumulation. As far as it gave, it's one of the more useless bounty hunter troops. Not really going to be used much. It's just kind of a little bit of poke damage, and outside of bounty, it is just as equally bad. Alchemist, pretty good. The first one of the kind of archetype that we've seen, because none of them really had it under common, or none of them did, where you can actually select a color and then transform it into something. So this ends up transforming something into yellow, while also giving a little bit of gold. There's one for souls, Valkyrie, as well as several other ones in a few of the other rarities and stuff like that. But overall, these used to be a lot better. They're still not horrible. However, due to how much you could just gem destroy and similar things, normally not as good value. As you're progressing through the game, can be pretty good, and if you need a lot of yellow in a pinch, can also be decent. But otherwise, doesn't get used too much in the current state of the game, despite being relatively decent in the past. As far as Amaro, just does some damage to an enemy, curse them, stuns them, poisons them. Quite a few effects overall, not really going to get used much, just have fast, so it could be a good low rarity way of applying those kind of things. However, there are better options later in the game. Rachnotar deals some true damage to an enemy, and if the enemy is webbed, ends up draining 5 mana and then webs the enemy. Overall, not too bad. There's much better things that do true damage, much better things that do web. Has a little bit of stealthy going for it, but most things that have those mechanics have stealthy anyways, so nothing really too interesting there. Archon Statue, while outside of Arena, is pretty horrible. It does have some pretty good synergy inside of Arena, because whenever it's missing HP, it does get to do 8 additional damage, which in Arena is pretty substantial. It is forced to have to its strongest, but overall, still not too bad in that regard. Outside of Arena, you're never going to be touching that in the current state of the game. As far as the Armored Borlad, this thing deals damage to an enemy if it's enraged, knocks them to the back. Another one of those kind of movement ones that doesn't tend to really get used, just doesn't do enough damage to really justify it or have any kind of board control. Anything that tends to not have any board control at all tends to be towards the lesser end. Banshee, not really too good. Does have a capability of gaining souls. This was actually added about 4 years ago. Didn't always used to have the ability to gain souls, and in the current state of the game, it actually hits max souls if you have really high magic. However, overall, not too good. It does get to do a little bit of red mana, which you can kind of do into some other troop. It doesn't use red itself. However, it could feed right into something. Not really something that you're going to be doing, but if you're earlier on in the game, can be a way to do damage while still gaining a little bit of souls. So at least has that going for it. But aside from that, not really something you're going to be using. Bastite Priestess is kind of interesting, because I believe it's the only conditional double convert currently within the game, where it transforms all green into purple, and if an ally happens to be death marked, it'll transform all yellow gems to skulls. This is obviously very annoying and kind of very situational, given that you specifically have to be death marked on your ally, not an enemy, specifically an ally, which is kind of hard to try to set up deliberately. There are some things that can do that deliberately, however, you generally don't want to go out of your way for it, and to use this only against death marked teams is also pretty inconsistent, so for the most part, it doesn't really get used. Might get some kind of usage as time goes on if death mark ever becomes extremely meta. It generally doesn't though, because there's a 1-turn delay, which if that was to ever be removed, could potentially be okay. However, due to its 1-turn delay and the fact that it keeps refreshing every time death mark is reapplied, doesn't really get much usage. However, if there was a consistent way to always have that without having to worry about the negative effects, 12 mana cost double convert, not necessarily too bad, but having to have a death mark on your team is just too inconsistent to really bother with, to bother using her. As far as Bat Swarm, it ends up transforming into Nosferatu. It's one of those kind of ones like the villager werewolf kind of thing, where it kind of just keeps transforming back and forth. This one being a little bit better just because it does have true damage, though it doesn't have specifically any board control over this thing. Not really something you would ever really bother putting onto your team. However, Nosferatu, ever so occasionally, I guess could kind of get used. It's pretty tanky, and if nothing else, it can be pretty tanky in Arena, or nice Arena pick. But beyond that, not really going to see much usage. As far as the Beetle Blade, deals damage to an enemy if there are 13 more brown gems, it deals triple damage. There are much more consistent ways to try to get that triple out there than bothering to use this thing. It's a little bit okay in the faction, however, it's pretty inconsistent on if it's actually going to be able to hit it, and normally you just spam for Beatrix because it's from the Deep Hive. Though, if nothing else, you're probably going to have this on your way of getting Beatrix, so at least it's something that can kind of do damage earlier on in the game, but beyond that, it's not really something you're going to be using. The Blightwing! Really bad in Arena. I've had so many bad times where this thing just gets like summoned and just seems like doesn't do anything, especially with all the lycanthropy that's finally going to be gone. Actually, by the time this video is out, it already is gone, but yeah, we don't need to worry about those coming from the sky anymore, which is going to be nice. But deals damage to an enemy. If the enemy's diseased, it ends up exploding 3 gems, and if the enemy is burning, it gets to explode 3 gems, basically meaning it never gets to explode any gems, because most of the time you're going to get this off of some kind of random mechanic that ends up summoning a beast or daemon, and generally speaking, you're not going to have disease or burning in those situations, meaning that's not going to get any explosions, making this ability very bad. If it was to get both sets of explosions, even then it still wouldn't be as good compared to things that can consistently do it without needing those conditions. Boar Rider, yet another goblin. All goblins have an automatic extra turn. This thing used to be a lot better in the past, however, it's still not horrible. It gets to remove a row, specifically remove and not destroy, so you do not accumulate the mana for it, but it gets to remove a row, do some damage, get an automatic extra turn. Some unique board control things that you can end up doing with this, however, overall, not really too useful in the current state. I used to have an 8 mana cost, it was nerfed to 11, and ever since then, hasn't really gotten much usage. Bombardier ends up exploding a gem, deals some damage to an enemy, or to a random enemy, and then a percent chance to end up burning them. Overall, not really going to get much usage. There's much better things like Goblin Rocket and other single explodes that are going to get way better value than this thing, and it's just outclassed compared to every other thing that does a single explode within the game, and not really something you're going to be bothering with. As far as the Bone-Bound Dredge, destroys a column, creates 2 Doom Skulls for every green gem destroyed, and then conjures a Bone Storm. This theoretically could be usable in a certain team, however, it is so situational and has such a low boost ratio that outside of Arena, you're not really going to be bothering to really run it. Just way too situational to try to get it rolling to really justify it, especially given that it's a brown-purple. That's a really common skull-related color class, so there's so many better things that can end up doing something similar. So for the most part, you're never really going to be bothering with it. As far as the Book of Secrets, it either summons a random daemon or curses cause a random status effect to all enemies or allies, or deal a bunch of damage to the first enemy. This is one of many troops. I don't think commons had anything like this. However, this is one of many troops that has so many RNG related things on its ability that is basically useless. Generally speaking, you want things that have really high consistency, and you don't want to have things that have very low consistency. And the more things that it could possibly do based on pure luck, the worse it generally is, unless those things are insanely good. And this is one of those instances where it's just way too luck based to ever really bother bringing out. As far as the Bugbear, actually not too bad. It deals damage to an enemy. Pretty much all goblins aren't bad though, but it deals damage to an enemy boosted by their missing HP. So the more HP that they're missing, the more damage it'll do. So if they're currently missing 100 HP, it will end up doing 50 additional damage. So not too bad. Plus he has the automatic extra turn. Not really too used because there's better damage sources out there. However, it's not horrible for what it is, and if nothing else, can be okay in Arena to get that little bit extra damage. Bullet is more so annoying than actually useful. It gets to knock the first enemy to the back and then deal some damage to them. However, the main gimmick that it has is there's a 50% chance they'll end up devouring it if there are 13 plus browns on the board. Basically meaning if there's 13 plus browns on the board, he will have a 50% chance of devouring the second slot, which will then be moved to first slot, regardless of if it lives or not, since it gets to knock the first one down. So overall, this is most notorious for being in a faction. The faction battle that has 2 of these can be very annoying, because the chance that one of them ends up casting is pretty likely, unless you win at a really quick pace. It also has immune to Devour, so you can't just go and directly try to devour it. You'd have to go curse it and then devour it, because it even has immune to stun as well, so it can be pretty annoying. And definitely got to be careful, especially if you're running a second slot Iron Gut, because there is some small instances where he will end up killing you because of that, so definitely be careful. As far as actually using it, you don't tend to use it too often. It can be a really good early game devourer, but beyond that, there are more consistent options within the game. It's more so just annoying than useful, though it can be not bad. Chaos Hound, one of those other ones, is just kind of too random. It either creates a bunch of normal skulls or a bunch of doom skulls or ends up summoning himself. He's somewhat okay for the faction, but beyond that, you're not really going to be using him. Clockwork Sphinx, actually not horrible at all. It's a really good board control option. Destroys all gems of a chosen color and then gives a bunch of armor boosted by gems destroyed at a 3-to-1. Pretty bad boost ratio. However, the main gimmick with this is how much board control it gets while also being able to boost armor. This could be used with Rowan. It could be used with Guard's Avatar. Pretty much kind of any kind of team that ends up needing that armor. There's a couple mech teams that use it too because you can do a half mana start off it, so it only needs 6 mana instead of 12. Overall, not too bad. Not something you would use in many teams, but it's situationally usable. Cockatrice, though. So here's one of the better rares in the entire game, as well as one of the better mana drainers, oddly enough. If you're looking for a good single target mana drainer, here it is. It has a relatively low base attack. It's actually worth mentioning just because of how ridiculously low it is, so it makes up for it slightly with the fact that it does double damage to Entangled, because it both entangles and mana drains an enemy. And by mana drain, I mean all of its mana. It also gets to create a bunch of brown boosted by the mana drained. So this thing is basically the superior version of all those troops that have a 14 mana cost that do that 12 mana drain thing. This is basically the better version of all of them, because not only does it feed mana back into itself, but it's also creating a pretty similar amount of gems. Normally it's creating about 8 gems on average, given that of course for every 4 mana you drain, you're getting that little bit extra brown. So ideally you'd be draining at least something with 8 mana to get to the total of 8 there for the 2 extra. But yeah, it has some base amount. You can end up getting Entangle, and you can end up getting the mana drain. So what's pretty useful about this is if something is both entangled and you sold their mana, well, that's everything that they can do that can do damage, because you got rid of all their mana so they can't cast, and you entangled them so they have 0 attack. So this can be very useful as you're progressing through the game to make sure that you basically take no damage whatsoever. It's also really good in Arena, though a little bit towards the slower side. But yeah, one of the better rares within the game. Definitely, if you haven't been using it, especially earlier on in the game, highly advise doing so. It's one of the ways that on a lot of my new player accounts I've managed to actually get by, because it basically makes sure that the enemy does literally nothing. You probably don't see me using it much these days, though, because later in the game there's just better options than it. However, before getting those better options, it is a very solid option. Also, you don't even need a +1 him, because generally you want to do a +1 on something that has 10 mana, so you can 2-turn it if you surge on it. However, because it has air link, you don't even necessarily need to give it a +1, though you generally do, because the extra brown is kind of nice, but it's not required. As far as Cocoon, it has one of these weird kind of summons. There's a few of them within the game. However, it summons a typing that technically does not exist. And what I mean by that is, of course, every single thing has like a typing, like this is a beast, this is a monster, so on and so forth. However, there are some things that summon a typing that technically is not actually a typing that is marked on the card. It's just a subsection of troops within the game. And in this case, it ends up summoning a random spider. So what is every single spider in the game? Who knows? Because they're not actually marked. We can kind of infer that anything that kind of looks like a spider is probably a spider. However, which is most of Zolcarrier, you know, a good number of them. However, yeah, it's not actually a typing, but it just summons a random spider. I can't remember if Web Spinner actually counts underneath that. I think it might, though Giant Spider does and a few of the other ones. But yeah, it's one of those kind of weird summons in there. There's another one for Knoll. I think there might be a few others here and there. But yeah, it's kind of weird because it's summoning something that technically is not marked anywhere. You just kind of have to assume if something is or isn't a spider. And even if we do get a new spider, we don't know for sure if they'll remember to add it into the spider drop table for something like Cocoon, which they probably forget. Corpse Mirror. So we haven't been seeing too many bounty troops. However, this is a pretty relevant one. Not the most relevant. I'm pretty sure most of you already know who the most relevant is once we get down to him in the T section. But as far as this thing, pretty decent option. Nice true damage, destroys a row, steals a bunch of life, which means it does gain that life as well. Not only do they lose that life, but you also gain it. And it's boosted by Skulls Destroyed, so you get a little bit of boost ratio. Overall, not too bad. Great arena pick, great bounty hunter pick, and beyond that, you wouldn't really use it. Outside of those, it's outclassed by other true damage. However, at least in those two locations, both arena and bounty hunter, it is a pretty solid pick, if nothing else. As far as the Corrupted Magnus, it curses an enemy and eliminates a bunch of stats from 2 random skills. So overall, you're pretty much never going to use this. It's kind of clunky to use. You can kind of do it for a little bit of stat reduction. However, there's so many better things that can do it without losing their turn, because it doesn't have any way to do any kind of board control. That is nice that he only has a 9 mana cost. However, he doesn't have anything in his traits that are really helping him too much. Overall, it's just outclassed by pretty much everything else that can end up doing stat reduction. Maybe not everything else, but a good number of them that end up doing it better. As far as Crabman, he's basically an arena-only pick. You wouldn't really get him for any other reason. He deals damage to the first and last enemy, and then also bleeds them. Bleed just doing a little bit of true damage. Also, I have no clue why they almost entirely refuse to do a true damage option that also has bleed. It feels so weird that so few of them just do, or so many of them do physical instead of true damage, but it doesn't really make much sense. On the topic of bounty hunter troops, here's one that is both a converter that we were mentioning earlier, as well as just an overall good bounty hunter troop that can actually be used outside of bounty hunter. Has 50% score reduction, which is one of the few that are even within bounty hunter. Gets the converted chosen color to brown, which is something that apothecary can already do with cleanse, and normally you do use apothecary instead. However, it does get to barrier submerge a random ally, which in some situations may be better, though generally speaking you do kind of want want to cleanse, as well as its coloration. But there are some instances where you bring it out. It does count as an elemental and a beast, so there are 2 different ways to give a half mana start. So if nothing else, there's that. Though generally you're going to do it probably off of elemental if you are going to end up doing it. Cyclops, kind of like a War, which is one of the mythics within the game, just a little bit of a cheaper version of it. Ends up dealing damage to an enemy, and then it's boosted by its attack. Overall, it's not really worth buffing just to try to get this down. Can be used in arena, can be used outside of arena, though the biggest issue is if you're just going to put a bunch of buffs just so it could hit one at a time, you might as well be doing something that can kill everything simultaneously. So overall, pretty slow option and not really something you'd normally go out of your way for. Also shares the same color with things like Mang and other things that can already one-shot pretty effectively, like hero weapons of that such, so not really worth using a troop that will be doing that slower. Dark Dryad, not really anything too useful. It's just kind of steal some armor, transforms it into a random skill, and then grants it to the first ally. You kind of use it for the faction occasionally, but for the most part, you wouldn't really bother with it that much else. You can kind of use it in the first slot behind a bunch of Alder Fathers, but generally just 4 Alder Fathers and then just try to get the Trent in there is perfectly fine. So overall, it's not really used for anything. Dark Maiden, very occasional pick, ends up transforming all yellow to a chosen color, and then ends up giving a bunch of life to the first ally, boosted by gems transformed. This used to be a lot better back in the day, however, it's still occasionally usable, not really something you would bring out too often though. Main thing that's kind of keeping it usable is it does have that green link going into itself, but overall it doesn't really end up doing much in the current state of game, and probably worth skipping compared to other mana accumulators. Dark Master, they did, as of finally, a few years ago, finally give it a little bit of damage. It used to just do like a static 9 damage, at least now it does it partially based on its magic. I believe it's actually half its magic plus 9. It still has the 9 damage. They just gave it half its magic as damage as well. So hey, it still has the 9 damage there. So I did get the number right, because that's 21 and then the 9 base value, which is what it used to do, is just the 9 base value with no extra. But I guess to summon Thrall, obviously, we know from the previous video how good Thrall is, so technically that's a pretty good summon. However, in the cases where you'd be using it, like something like Arena, Thrall is not good in Arena despite how good he is outside of Arena, which is one of those rare instances where it's the other way around, oddly enough. However, he's still okay overall in Arena, and you wouldn't really use him outside of Arena, unfortunately. You might as well just use Thrall instead at this point and just use a Thrall in his place, as the thing he summons is one of the rare instances where the thing that something summons is actually stronger than the troop that summons it, which is kind of funny. There are a few instances in the game, like Orion's Herald and a few others like that. However, this one is definitely, I don't think, intended to be actually summoning something stronger than what it is, but it is indeed doing so. As far as deckhand, pretty useful. Actually, it ends up creating 5 purple and then transforms all purple to blue. Being able to do this while feeding mana back into yourself has some really good synergies. I don't feel like anything in the current state of the game uses it too well. However, as time goes on and more options get introduced into the game, this has a lot of potential to be very broken. I don't feel like it's super broken in the current state. However, it's definitely a trip to keep an eye on underneath rares. This has a lot of potential. So Devour is one of those gem creating ones that has quite a decent ability to extra turn. It's gotten a lot of usage in the past, and while very situational in the current state of the game, is still good. The main way that you use it is it destroys a column, so you normally either hit all the way in the left column or all the way in the right column, which either one has less browns. And essentially what you do with this is you end up making the board smaller, and this makes it a higher chance that you'll end up landing an extra turn off of those browns. It also gains a little bit of mana. But it's just kind of an alternative brown mana accumulator. There's other things better for mana accumulation. However, you might occasionally use it like some kind of mech team. Occasionally dwarf teams end up using it too. Overall, not the greatest compared to most other options, and given that you can just do it in the kingdom, Apothecary is normally the better choice. As far as the Deep Dwarf, it transforms all green gems of a chosen color and then creates a stone block. This is actually the only thing I believe in the entire game that could theoretically infinitely create a stone block, or the blocks as I call them. So that's the kind of thing. There's not really enough ways to get enough of them onto the board to really do any kind of effective strategy. However, there are some kind of weird things that you could theoretically do by kind of just keep constantly looping a very small section if you could actually get a gem spawn and get all the blocks around it. However, there's currently no viable way to build a stone block build in the current state of the game. That might change, and maybe he'll become a little bit more useful once that does change, but in the current state there just isn't really viable enough. There just isn't enough troops that create enough stone blocks to really build a build around it. As far as this thing, it eliminates a bunch of attack from an enemy and then inflicts 3 random stats effects. Not really something that you're going to bother be doing. There's better things that can end up applying stats effects. One of them is even under rare, the Dragonet, if I'm not mistaken, which we'll be getting down to it soon, and it's basically just an inferior version of that for the most part, though it does get to steal some attack, but or eliminate some attack, not steal. It doesn't get to claim it, just reduces it. But as far as the next one, the Demon Naga, as far as this one, it creates a bunch of purple gems and then gives all purple allies a quarter of their mana. This can be okay. It's a pretty nice burst. Biggest issue is it doesn't really loop too well into a lot of other things. However, it is a lot of purple mana. The only really unfortunate thing is its inconsistency with how much it ends up doing. But again, that little bit extra quarter is kind of nice on top of the fact that it already still has a gem spawn. As far as the next one, we have the Detectobot. This thing gives all other allies a quarter of their mana and then creates 7 reds for each enemy with full mana. There's a 50% chance to self-destruct. So this is kind of interesting if and only if the enemy had 2 empowers at the starting board, or just full mana on 2 of them in general, and you can kind of get this going. The biggest issue is it has a chance to destroy itself. If this had a 0% chance to destroy itself, this could actually be like ridiculously over the top meta as far as like what it could end up doing synergy wise, because as long as they had 2 full manas, you're just gonna get like near infinite mana, especially if they had 3 full enemies with mana. You basically just like deliberately let them get mana on everything and then let them cast once, and then you just infinitely cast with like Queen of Tanya or something. Unfortunately, its ability to self-destruct is a pretty big negative, and obviously it'll die after about 7 tries or so, so it cannot infinite loop. It would be fun if it could, but yeah, it would have so much potential if it did not destroy itself. Overall, it's not really worth using because of its capability of destroying itself. There's a lot of other more consistent things that do not try to destroy itself. As far as the Dire Boar, mostly just an arena pick. Destroys a row, deals some damage to the first 2 enemies. Pretty standard kind of damaging ability. One of the slightly better ones, though it does have no boost ratio to go with it. Overall, not too bad, but not something you would ever really bother using outside of Arena. Next, we have the Dire Cub. Ends up giving a bunch of life to the first 2 allies, or give them a bunch of attack, or grants random positive stats effects to them. Regardless, even if all 3 of those were to occur, I'm pretty sure it still wouldn't be viable. So, yeah, it's pretty bad. Unfortunately, all 3 of those could still be a thing, and I'm pretty sure it still wouldn't be used. It would be a lot more viable, but I'm pretty sure it still wouldn't be used compared to Mang and other similar options. It's pretty much every brown-red that ever exists that has an attack buff or something similar, or doing something attack-related. It basically has to compete with hero classes Mang, just because of how much value it ends up getting, especially earlier on in the game when a lot of these are like supposed to be used, but then you just get Mang and it's like, oh, that's just way better. As far as Dijin, it is very underwhelming given that it's actually summoned off of one of those mythics. It's very unfortunate. I wish they would have buffed it around that time, but they didn't end up doing it. It gives some life to an ally, and then either creates 6 gems of their mana color, or gives them 2 magic, and even if it did both of those things, once again, it would basically be just as useless, similar to Dire Club, except even more useless, because at least Dire Club with all those would at least be somewhat better. But Dijin, even if it did both its either ors, would still be horrible. As far as the Domanovi, ends up giving a bunch of life to all allies, boosted by brown gems. Not much of a boost ratio, so it's not really doing too much. Also gets to grant a random stats effect to a random ally. Overall, not really doing much for you. It's just a little bit of an HP buff. Better off just using Divinia or any of the many other things that kind of do something similar. But Divinia does basically what it does, like tenfold. It is a legend, however. It is so much better and essentially does exactly what it does. Doppelganger is actually interesting. I don't feel like it has too much viability. However, there's one really unique thing that you can do with this. This transforms into an enemy and then curses them. So one thing that you can end up doing with this is if you see, or if there's a troop you wanted to try, let's say there's a mythic that you don't have, because it's very likely, if there's a mythic that you're missing, but you want to try and see how the mythic is, what you can do is you can build a team just as if you would be building the mythic, and then use a doppelganger in the spot where you would want that mythic to be that you don't currently own. Then you need to find an enemy team that has it, or do an explore, something similar, and then transform into that mythic. And then boom, there you go. You now have a team that you can go test out while testing the mythic that you don't own. So it won't be fully traded or anything, the thing that you end up stealing. However, it will still have the ability. So if you're using it just for its ability, you can kind of test out mythics as well as legends if you happen to not have a legend that you don't have. So kind of interesting. Outside of that context, I don't really feel like it's viable at all. It's a really slow option compared to just using whatever you're about to copy. Obviously, if you have almost everything in the game, it's just better just to use whatever you're about to do anyways, as far as what you would have copied. However, it's good for trying stuff if you don't own it, so that's a pretty cool mechanic that he ends up having, and it's the only thing that can consistently do this. There's one other thing from this faction, I believe the legend, that ends up doing kind of the same thing, but it's percent chance. This does that 100% chance, and you don't need an extra slot for it, so it's really good for testing teams. Dragonet, I was kind of just mentioning earlier, is basically a superior version of the other one. Still a bit underwhelming in the current state of game. However, it does get to do some damage and inflict 1 to 5 stats effects. If it ends up doing 5 stats effects, that is actually the most amount of stats effects that any troop has, other than Essence of Evil. as far as like pretty much any option in the game that can get down in one cast. Obviously, the chance that it specifically hits that many is RNG, since it can do as little as 1. However, if it does hit 5, that's the closest thing you have to Essence of Evil. So that's pretty cool. Obviously, just using Essence of Evil is easy enough to obtain weapon that in almost every situation, you just use hero classes Essence of Evil instead of Dragonet. However, there might be some instances, plus it gets summoned off a couple things. Speaking of things that get summoned off of, 25% chance to summon Dragonet on death, the Dragatar. Dragatar, probably one of the most, if not the most viable dragon rare. One of the main things that ends up doing is it destroys a column and then gives all dragon allies specifically a bunch of attack and armor. And while a buff like this generally isn't too good, the fact that he has board control to go with it, as well as a somewhat decent boost ratio, particularly for arena, can make him a little bit viable. Later game dragon teams, well, don't even exist because they're so off meta in the current state of the game. However, they don't really use Dragatar anymore, but as you're progressing through the game and building a dragon team, especially if you have a Dragon Soul laying around, you can get a lot of value out of Dragatar. And same as arena, you just put this into your team, you just kind of get a lot of buffs. Of course, it only does it to dragons, but if you had even one other dragon, you're getting double the value, so you can end up doing pretty good in arena. But it's kind of just for dragon teams as you're progressing through the game, but a really solid option for doing so. And dragons do shine a little bit earlier in the game because that's where they're balanced quite a bit more, is for early to mid game. Anyways, as far as this troop, you never actually use it in your team because you would use Drake Rider, which is an ultra rare instead, which is a 100% chance of summoning it on death. However, this thing ends up doing some splash damage, so it does 50% to adjacents as well as just doing some damage there. You would never really draft it in arena unless you're forced to, and you would never actually put it into your team because if you're even going to bother with something like this, you would just do Drake Rider instead. So the troop itself generally isn't used. However, it is still viable to have it upgraded, which I actually don't have it upgraded right now, just because of Drake Rider. Anyways, as far as Dragur, ends up draining up to 12 mana from an enemy and then creates purple gems equal to the mana drain. So this is one of those many options. I believe the only one underneath Freyr, oddly enough, that I was kind of mentioning earlier, where they're basically an inferior cockatrice, where they end up draining a bunch from the enemy. They don't even feed mana to themselves. They have a cap on how much they could do. I'm not sure why they end up making these so weak. I guess the one was just too strong, and they just decided to nerf all of them. But in doing so, they just made all of them like worse than cockatrice and quite a few other mana drains within the game. So yeah, every single one that is like this is pretty bad. At least this one's a lower rarity, so at least it's easier to obtain, but still, you just use cockatrice, it's better. Dread Steed, this thing ends up death marking an enemy and then creates a bunch of purple gems boosted by death marked enemies. Overall, it's kind of too inconsistent. Even if you get 4 times death mark, it could maybe be okay there. However, it doesn't feed mana back into itself, which is the main thing that's missing, and trying to get that many death marks can be very situational on if you would have a team to really do that. This thing charms a random enemy and then creates a bunch of blue. Overall, not really something that you're going to be doing. Maybe a arena pick occasionally. It's not really something you'd bother putting into your team though, and most dragon teams would want to be using other mechanics as instead of charm. I believe it is the only dragon charmer in the game though. Charm is actually a pretty underused mechanic. It basically does damage to the first and the enemy above and below based on the attack value of the enemy. We mentioned earlier too that Leshy can kind of end up countering charm. However, there aren't too many good charms in the game, and that is very much not a good charm. Dryad is actually pretty solid, very situational when you would really use it though. As you're progressing through the game, it can be a really great choice to have. Has Nature Link, which gives it a little bit more green, which is very useful because it actually creates a bunch of green off its ability. It also gives a bunch of life healing and creates green, and gives barrier, I mean, when it does its ability. So gives a little bit of life, ends up healing that amount of life. Though heal, do keep in mind, does not actually raise the cap. Giving life does, but the other part of its ability will just heal whatever is currently missing. It does not actually give it HP. But the main gimmick with it is that you can end up spamming a barrier and then feeding a bunch of green. Of course, one obvious synergy that you can kind of do this with is Rowan. However, there are better things to mana generate for Rowan, but there's a few other instances where you kind of bring it out. Overall, not horrible, not the greatest. You probably almost never see me using it just because there are better options out there. So, Dust Devil, this thing is, this thing. 5 years ago, this alone, just it. We used to be able to clear quicker than anything in the entire game back when he actually used to boost based on magic. Obviously, he just does a static 5 damage now. However, in the most recent year, several months ago, we of course ended up getting the Iron Hawk added to the game, which is arguably the best mythic in the entire game now, because if you use a bunch of them with Dust Devil, or even just one with a Slayer hero class, though ideally 2 for the best build, Greed or any other Empower plus Dust Devil plus double Iron Hawk, creates the quickest quick kill team in the entire game, meaning Dust Devil is, I'm not sure where you'd really rank him because he needs other stuff to really kind of function. However, that team composition in its totality is probably one of the top 5 teams in the entire game, and it requires Dust Devil. So yeah, pretty good. Has Air Link, though that's normally not too relevant, but it allows him to get his ability back up if he so needs. He starts with full mana, so you get to just do his ability from the start. And one pretty nice thing about this is it's an Empower that immediately has knockback. You generally don't use it for this mechanic, however, it is a thing that exists. Ends up knocking the first enemy to the last position on turn 1. So the very second the battle starts, you can move whatever they currently have, like maybe a triple damage burning, hero class, or whatever other annoying thing they have, like a web spinner that does triple damage, or anything like that. You can just immediately move it to last slot. Of course, it will sacrifice one of your slots. However, it is definitely a strategy that can be used and pretty viable. Overall, really solid rare, among one of the better ones, like Cockatrice level. I'm not sure why they like making brown-yellow so good, but yeah, all the brown-yellow rares seem to be pretty decent, though not so much because Dwarven Zombie's pretty bad. There is a gimmick that can be used with him. Anyways, as far as Dwarven Lord, he just deals some damage, gains a bunch of armor if he gets a kill, basically used entirely for arena and no other purpose. You would never really bother bringing him out otherwise. So this thing gets to convert all green gems to brown and then eliminates a bunch of armor from an enemy, boosted by gems destroyed. You're pretty much only using him for his convert. One nice thing about this, though, is he does convert into his own color, so he can loop a little bit depending on the kind of situation. Overall, you're not really going to be using him. Also, that's not the troop I thought it was. I thought that was the one that converts all the skulls to Doom Skulls, because there are a few synergy things that can be done with that. But anything that creates its own color isn't horrifically bad, though. This one is pretty situational. Elven Bard is outclassed by Tulio, so you basically never use this. It gives some magic to an ally, and mana equal to half their mana cost, and then enchants them. Pretty useless. There's already troops that do what it does way better. Envy, you basically never put into your team unless you're specifically going to be going and picking an arena. This is one of the best arena troops in the entire game. However, outside of arena, it is very bad. It deals some damage to the 2 strongest enemies, boosted by enemies at full life and full mana, meaning that if the entire enemy team was at full life currently, it would be able to do 16 additional damage, and it is hitting 2 things, so it'd be doing 32 additional damage. That is 32 additional damage in arena, where basically that means double one-shot. So yeah, that's pretty insane, and it's not even counting if they have full mana, in which case he does even more. Outside of arena, though, those numbers are really pitiful. But inside arena, and if you just started off, like if you're like below level 500 and you find this thing, could be okay. But beyond that, it falls off very quickly. It's very front-loaded with how much damage it has, that is for sure. Eternal Sentry, not really used too often, though it has a pretty interesting gimmick. It increases an ally's attack by their armor. So if they have a ridiculously high armor, they can then have a ridiculously high attack, assuming they didn't lose their armor before then. And it also creates a light storm. Pretty much would never be used in a team, however, other than for pure faction. But it is an interesting gimmick and could potentially have some kind of really broken use in the future, where you kind of just go boost your armor like crazy, then you boost your attack like crazy, and then just auto win. But in the current state of the game, nothing really too special that you can end up doing that with. Oddly enough, one of the bigger synergies that probably has synergy with his Queen Jezebel, due to the fact that it gains both attack and armor with its ability, plus uses its attack as a hit. But aside from that, it's a really slow option, not really used, and not really worth it. It's basically an Empower that just increases its attack, does have a column, does get to do a little bit of damage up front. There's just so many better things that do skull damage, and it doesn't have any kind of multiplier. If it had some kind of 2x multiplier or Hunter's Mark like every skull or something else to just kind of give it that little bit extra damage, it'd be kind of okay. However, the fact that it's an attack gainer that doesn't have any kind of way to multiply that attack and just has a little bit of a additive attack bonus to it, it's not really going to end up doing much. Excavator is a bounty hunter troop that is used occasionally for bounty hunter. It can also be used outside of bounty hunter, though generally isn't due to better mana accumulators existing. However, it gets to destroy a column, creates a bunch of red, and then is boosted by brown gems destroyed. This isn't too bad. If you end up getting 3 browns destroyed, that'll end up being a total of 11 browns, and basically is like a better excavator, or not better excavator, is excavator, a better deborer, I mean, if you can get at least 3 browns hit with his ability, except it does it for red instead of brown, so it's pretty much just an alternative deborer, just in a different kind of setup that can also be used for bounty hunter. But that's essentially what it is, just for a different color and slightly different with how it works, given that it requires the boost ratio. At 2 destroys, it's basically the exact same thing as Devour, just for red instead, except it doesn't do the, it's 2 higher mana costs, and it doesn't end up doing the armor gain. So in some instances, even weaker than Devour, oddly enough, the same premise. Executioner, basically you would never use this. However, he does have a really gimmicky 10% chance to just insta-kill. That's too low of a chance to really ever bother using. However, he is the lowest rarity thing that has a mechanic that has this. that has a realistic mana cost, unlike that one that has a 50 mana cost underneath commons. However, you wouldn't really bother with it. It's too RNG based to ever really bother with. Deal damage to an enemy, disease them, poison them, just kind of standard kind of poke, nothing really too special there. Fey Cap does a bunch of scatter damage. There's 50% chance it ends up diseasing a random enemy. There's so many better ways to end up diseasing. You might as well just use Truffle or something similar, just really bad option. Fire Lizard, pretty decent, particularly in Arena. Outside of Arena, you won't really use it too often. However, it can be not horrible. It deals some damage to a random enemy and then creates a bunch of red. This is a kind of category, kind of like the rock worms or all the worms underneath commons, except it's a rare variant. There are a couple different versions of this. I believe some of them might even be ultra rare. And basically, they create a bunch of color of their own color, kind of like how the worms do, and also gets to do a little bit of different damage. So this ends up doing a burn plus the random damage, so you can end up getting a lot of burns, a lot of spread damage overall. It's pretty inconsistent, but it can feed back into itself. Overall, not the greatest, but can be useful at times. Flame Maiden removes all blue gems and deals damage to an enemy, boosted by blue gems removed. Not really going to end up doing much, not really worth using to any degree anywheres. Frost Archer, similar, not really something you'd bother using, just deals some damage to an enemy and freezes them. If the enemy is already frozen, it deals a little bit of extra additional damage. That is so low, even in Arena, it seems really low. And then freezes the adjacent enemies, only specifically if they were already frozen. It kind of needs another freezing option to even be viable, and at that point you might as well just use the Frostfire Legends, and just way superior compared to Frost Archer. Frost Giant, really random, inconsistent kind of damage. Can be really good early on in the game, can be good in Arena. Outside of those contexts, isn't really used though it does have a little bit extra freeze if nothing else. So, the Frostfire Wraith. So, I've been mentioning Frostfire Keep a couple times here. Frostfire Keep has a few pretty good options, most notably being the Legend and this thing. So, one thing really noteworthy about this, other than the fact that 4 of him can be ran for the pure faction for this place, which is kind of funny, because he's actually just that good. He is the lowest rarity troop in the entire game that has 65% score reduction, meaning that if you want to get 65% score reduction, all you have to do is get about 100 Chaos Shards, go to the Underworld, go to Frostfire Keep, throw those Chaos Shards in, and might even get in less than 100, and you just got yourself a troop that has 65% reduction, score reduction. On top of that, he gets a Steel Life, and that is specifically Steel, meaning that he gets to accumulate that life, and it's boosted by Frozen and Burning, though that aspect of it you generally don't use as much, since you're normally just going to be using him as a tank if you're bothering to put him in your team, and you might not necessarily have those other 2 mechanics on your team. But yeah, this is the cheapest, most affordable, easy to obtain tank if you're looking for one as you're progressing through the game. Definitely worth considering in that regard, since a lot of the things that have 65% reduction or better are all legends or higher, and this thing is only a rare, and it's a faction rare at that, making it even easier to obtain than a normal rare. So yeah, this thing is pretty insane in that regard. Also, it can half mana start off of elemental and off of undead. So yeah, overall, not too bad. It's not the greatest thing in the game, but if you're looking for a cheap, easy to obtain tank, he is one of the things, one of the most noteworthy ones that you could do in that regard. So, Knoll, this thing is pretty crazy. So, it ends up dealing some damage with a 50% chance to hit the wrong enemy. There's a whole typing of these that are called Knolls. They can also end up be summoning off of the random mechanic. And if the enemy uses Brown, it deals triple damage. These are commonly used on Guild Wars in order to counter on a specific color day. Obviously, this one for Brown Guild War Day. So definitely has some potential in that regard. Ends up becoming enraged when an enemy dies. So as soon as they die, boom, you'll have that 1.5 times damage. You have 2 times damage here, and do keep in mind that stacks, so that is 3 times total damage. And it also has some score reduction. Not the greatest of them, though definitely a pretty solid option, and it's only a rare, so pretty nice. As far as the Goblet, this thing entangles the first 2 enemies, or gives half mana to the first 2 allies, then gain an extra turn. This thing, due to the either or, is way too consistent. If it did both those 2 things, it would probably be viable. However, the fact that it's either or, it is not. Luckily, this one does do both. The Goblin Shaman used to be a lot better back in the day, even though it hasn't been a change, but it creates some green, ends up giving a life to a random ally, and then gain an extra turn. Overall, not really worth using. Not much you can really do with it loop-wise or anything like that. I guess you could kind of try feeding Truffle with it, but there's just so many other things that are just better. But yeah, it's not really used too much. There are so many better things you could end up putting into a Truffle team that that thing's just generally not going to be used in the current state of game, but can be if you truly want to. Golden Ring, this is one of those useless treasure items. You can ascend it if you want, however, there's no point in doing so. Hopefully they'll add some kind of way to upgrade these, because gosh, we have like 3,000 golden rings. Greed. So Greed is a pretty noteworthy one to mention. This one, really good rare. The most noteworthy thing about this is the most efficient way in the entire game to hit max gold instantly. as long as you have 100 durability on your greed, which might sound high, but you can also end up doing 24 additional life by going a bunch of Yasmin's tokens, those rare tokens they end up getting from just doing a bunch of explore, and give him 24 additional life to make it a little bit easier for him to do it. But he gains gold equal to how much life he has, so if he has at least 100, you just gain the full max capacity of gold regardless of your other bonuses. So this is very good for instantly hitting that cap. It is the quickest thing in the entire game to gain that cap due to the fact that it has Empower, and if you have enough HP, you can one turn it. So pretty nice. Has a little bit of explosion at the start, which isn't necessarily a good thing, because if you're looking to go quick, which you generally are in a lot of the teams that you're using him for, this actually slows you down a little bit, which actually in the Dust Devil team is occasionally better to not even use greed. You'll get less gold, however it is quicker to not have this explosion at the start of battle. However, it is useful if you're doing a longer battle, though there aren't too many longer battles that you end up using him for. He used to be used for Scouting Key team, however not really that viable in the current state of the game ever since Scouting Key got nerfed last December. Overall though, pretty nice thing to have, and if you're ever going to be doing a instant gold to max kind of team, definitely worth using, and it's used on quite a few different farming teams. As far as Griffin Knights, deals damage to a random enemy and then creates some yellow. Not really anything too noteworthy. The fact that it's random makes it rather unfortunate. As far as Hag, inflicts a random status effect, speaking of random, on an enemy, gives a bunch of skill points to a random skill to a random ally. So basically a random effect into a random effect into a random effect, so yeah, it's useless. As far as Half Main, it deals some damage to an enemy, and if the enemy's attack is greater, it deals double damage. This can be situationally okay. The fact that it has 75% starting mana is the main reason why this thing isn't completely useless, otherwise it would be pretty underwhelming. However, the fact that it could do double damage to things that have greater attack, and the fact that if you have like multiple on your team and you just even surge on a red or yellow, you pretty much fill every single one of them. It can be used on occasion. Overall, not the greatest out there, however, it can do some pretty big burst damage, so it has that going for it. Overall, not really used too often though. Harpy, pretty useless, just gives a bunch of life to all allies, and if there's a storm, drains some mana from all enemies. Could potentially be worth upgrading though, because there are things that can end up summoning towards it. If you're using like a Harpy Mage on your team, all those things kind of end up eventually summoning down to a Harpy, so there is a chance that you would eventually end up getting this team just off of a random summon. If you use any of the other things from Stonesong Aerie, and the legend from there is not too bad. The Harpy Mage is the most viable thing there. It's a really good mana accumulator. It's basically a second turn in power, kind of like Leprechaun, except whenever you have enchant active, so has a lot of potential. However, you would never actually use Harpy into your team specifically. You would get it occasionally off of summons and then use it. However, outside of that context, you would never specifically put a Harpy into your team. As far as Hellclaw Hunter, deals damage to an enemy, boosted by red and purple gems, and then conjures a Hellstorm. Overall, not really anything too interesting. It's one of the weaker things that end up coming in, which kind of makes sense from rare from the Palace Kingdom. Overall, not really something you're going to be using, and there's better things that ends up doing the Hellstorm Storm, which is a red-purple storm, if I'm not mistaken, which is in itself not too bad of a storm. However, there are way better ways to apply it. As far as Hellhound, deal damage to a random enemy and then burn or disease. Once again, either or, and even if it did both, it would still be bad. It's basically just one of the standard damage pokes with a little bit of extra. As far as the Hieronif, this thing you would never generally specifically use in your team. However, having it upgraded isn't necessarily bad. Actually, I should probably upgrade mine because, you know what, I'm going to upgrade it right now. The main reason why you want to upgrade this is there's actually a hero class that utilizes, particularly the Thief hero class. However, it can be done on a few other hero classes as well. And the main gimmick with this is it has a 25% chance to be summoned whenever you're using Thief hero class or a few of the other ones that have the similar perk that allows it to be summoned. And basically every single time you cast, you'll have the chance of getting it in. And it's used on Thief because you have both the Bandit that has a 35% chance of occurring, as well as the Hieronif that has a 25% chance per cast to occur. So basically you just have a billion summons and they just become extremely tanky, extremely annoying. Used mostly for Guild War defense. You would never specifically use it on your team for the most part. However, it is good to have it upgraded just in case you are using a Thief hero class, so you can end up going just ridiculous summon spam when you're doing a defend team for Guild Wars. So overall, it's used for that. However, you wouldn't really actually specifically use it on your team generally. As far as the Hippocampus, it ends up destroying a row and gives a bunch of life to a random ally, boosted by Yellow's Gem Destroyed, and then double the effect if the ally uses blue. It's one of those buffers that generally isn't going to be too good. At least it has some board control, unlike many other buffers. However, it's just a buff that isn't really going to get you too far. As far as Hippogriff, it just deals some damage to an enemy, and if the enemy has Hunter's Mark on them, it deals triple. This obviously doing dealing triple damage could be okay. However, it doesn't have any way itself to place Hunter's Mark, and to get that kind of synergy is just generally too much work to really bother making it work. So overall, not really too good. Horned Asp, given that it has 75% mana star, it can be one of the quicker ways earlier on in the game to apply bleed, though it's not really that good of an ability, mostly because, once again, it does not do true damage. It's another one of those bleed options that has physical damage combined with bleed, which makes no sense because of how bleed works. You would really want that to be true damage, but it does some splash for 50% to adjacents, ends up inflicting bleed and poison on all enemies hit by the spell, basically meaning that they could potentially take 2 damage per turn, 1 off the bleed and then 1 off the poison. And if you were to stack that bleed to 4, it would potentially take 10 or 11 damage on that turn. 10 if just from the bleed 4 stack, and the poison 1 if it ends up triggering off of 50%. Overall, not really used, but can be a way to kind of refresh bleed and kind of do that if you want to do it in like a lower level kind of team. Overall, generally not really worth it though. So, Horned Guardian. I'm pretty sure everyone has nightmares of this if you've ever tried doing Pure Faction of the Labyrinth. You definitely want to kill this thing as immediately as possible. It's generally pretty bad, however, inside the context of that faction, it is like a mythic and a half. But it gains a bunch of armor and barrier, and then knocks a random enemy to the back. You would never really use this thing. However, yeah, it's insanely good for the faction. It basically comes down to whose Horned Guardian lives and whose Horned Guardian dies on if it you can actually win it. And if both Horned Guardian live and there's no way, it becomes a stalemate that never ends because they're both so tanky. But overall, there's better tanks in the game. You wouldn't really bother using this outside the context of the faction. However, you definitely want to make sure your Horned Guardian lives and theirs dies as quickly as possible if you're doing that faction. As far as Hound of Yagwe, he ends up exploding some skulls and then gains a bunch of attack. Overall, really horrible. Not really anything special there. Ice Wraith deals some damage to an enemy and freezes them. If the enemy is already frozen, steals some mana. There's just so many better options out there. This is a bounty troop, however, not really that good of one. Jackalope ends up mana burning, which deals damage based on how much mana they have, plus whatever its magic is. So if they have 10 mana currently, this would end up doing 52 because they're 42 magic combined with the mana as that they take as damage. And it's boosted by its magic. I'm not sure why it specifically says that. All mana burn is base boosted by its magic. And then it transforms all yellow to blue, just kind of like a little bit of transform. Overall, almost everything with mana burn is pretty underwhelming. Kelpie! So this thing was the faction that this came in. So he was actually, this could theoretically be the 1000th troop in the game right here that we're doing this whole series for, since 4 troops technically came in at the same time to make us have 1000 troops, and Kelpie is one of them. Overall, nothing too interesting though. It drains some mana from an enemy, and then deal some damage to them, and if there's and then you deal a 2% chance to devour per mana that you drain. So it has a max of 12% chance to end up getting a devour. Overall, nothing really too special. Obviously, way better devours, even under just these rares. We've already seen as high as 50% off of something like a bullet, even though it's conditional on 13 plus brown. But something like 12% just way too low to really bother with. So overall, pretty bad. And yeah, it's not really something you'd bother using. Even for the faction itself, you don't even bother using it for pure faction. As far as our next one, deal some damage to an enemy and it's boosted by skulls, and then either gain an extra turn or create some skulls. It's too inconsistent. Boost ratio is too bad. You don't really ever use it. As far as Kotani, another one was kind of useless one. Just deals a little bit of splash and then submerges itself. Pretty underwhelming. That's really something that gets used. This thing eliminates 40 from a random skill on an enemy, boosted by its souls, and then removes all yellow. So not really something that's going to get too much usage. You can kind of use it a little bit for like its elimination spam. However, Zura and many other options in the game do it way better, and just not really something you're going to bother using, even in the context of the faction itself. Not really something you're really going to be bothering to bring out. Anyways, Lion Prince, this one's actually not horrible. Hey, that's 20% this week too. But it destroys a row and deals damage to the first 2 enemies, boosted by Yellow Gem Destroyed. This could be okay as an early game option. If you're looking for an early game tank that can also do a pretty decent amount of damage, can be decent. It's also really good in Arena. If you see this thing in Arena, you should almost always draft it, as it's a pretty auto win. Not the most auto win thing in Arena, however, it's pretty decent as far as an option. Later in the game, it's not really something you bother using, as there are much better options that become accumulated. However, as you're kind of progressing through the game, definitely a thing to keep an eye on because of its really good boost ratio, and for that reason, it also makes him decent in Arena. This bounty trip's pretty underwhelming. Just gives a bunch of attack and armor to an ally and then barriers them. However, it is one of the only few ways you can currently barrier within Bounty Hunter. It's not the only way, and for that reason, it's even worse because there are other ways of doing it. If it was literally the only way, he might be a little bit more viable. However, there are other things that do it underneath Bounty, so not really something you're going to bother using it for. As far as Mana Core Cub, Charms the first enemy and then drains their mana by 3. This is kind of weird because charming the first enemy already makes it do half as much damage because it does damage to the one above and the one below with its attack value, and since there's nothing above it, it will only hit the one below. This seems as weird as things that do splash damage when they are forced to have to hit first enemy because they only get to do one of those two for splash damages. I'm not sure why they have so many troops like this. So it's not too many. There's like, what, 5 maybe? However, every single one of them that has that mechanic just seems completely pointless, and this one is no different, especially because that mana drain is so ridiculously small, especially if you compare it to the 10 mana cost Cockatrice and what it can do for the exact same. Marsh Strangler, this thing deals some damage to an enemy and then is boosted by entangled enemies. Overall, not too good. It does have an okay boost ratio, however, setting it up is not really worth it, so you wouldn't really bother using it for that purpose. Otherwise, it's just basically a small damage poke that's not really going to be doing anything. Mech Rat ends up removing all brown gems and gains a bunch of gold for each gem removed, and then there's a chance to equal to the gold to summon a Mech Rat. This thing's basically useless because it summons even more useless of things of itself, so not really anything too useful there. Mermaid can be an okay bounty trip on occasion, mostly because there's a little bit of board clear. It has a 2 explode with some damage. Outside of a Bounty Hunter, you'd basically never use this. However, inside Bounty Hunter, it's not horrifically bad. I don't feel like I've used it in the last several, however, it can still be usable if nothing else. Next one we have here is the Mer Shark. It ends up dealing some true splash damage to an enemy, and it's boosted by Submerge. You wouldn't really use this, even in Sea of Sorrows. There's already better options like the Legend, so overall pretty bad. As far as the Mega Vorax, pretty interesting one. I don't feel like most people bother using this. However, it does have some pretty decent synergy. Ends up dealing some damage to an enemy and then creates 6 blue gems, boosted by Submerged allies. So there's one gimmick with this. Anything that ever has Submerge or Bless or a similar boost ratio, they actually remove this effect when they do their ability. So anything that has Enchant, Submerge, Bless, any of those kind of mechanics that get removed when you cast, do not actually boost ratio off themselves in the current state of the game. That might be changed at some point. However, let's say you had 4 Submerges on your team. The most you can ever have for this ability is 3, due to the fact that it currently cannot be boosted by itself, even if it is submerged itself. However, that is still pretty nice. Being able to get 3 of them is a 15 total, 9 off a boost ratio, 15 with its other amount. So it's pretty easy to keep your team having that submerge too. There's quite a few things that can submerge pretty easily, like Hero Class. There's a mythic that can 4 times your entire team with a single extra turn, which you would have gotten off the blue spam anyways. So there's a few really niche instances where you could basically use this as a thing that can create 15 blue at a rather consistent rate. It has a little bit of a high mana cost. If this thing was a 9 mana cost, it'd probably get a lot more usage, but it can still find its way into some teams. So overall, definitely maybe worth considering for some blue spam. However, there's generally better options out there, but not horrible if nothing else. As far as the Midge Swarm, this thing's a really good arena pick. You also use it a little bit earlier in the game because its overall amount of damage isn't too bad because it has a base value of 8, and since it ends up doing everything twice, it ends up having a base value technically of 16 in a sense. But it does a bunch of scatter damage twice, meaning if it gains any additional magic, it is gaining that benefit 2 times over as well, and it's basically a nice way to kind of clean up damage. It also kind of deals with some with a barrier, not too bad because the first instance of damage will get rid of the barriers, and then you'll have another instance of damage to follow up with. Not the greatest thing in the game, but as you're progressing through the game, it's definitely not a horrible option and really good for arena. Generally, anything that's really good early on in the game also tends to be good in arena, with very few exceptions. Mine Eater deals damage to an enemy, and then if they survive, ends up stealing some magic. Overall, not too bad, and its magic gain is dependent on if it actually ends up surviving. This thing does some true damage to the weakest enemy and poisons them, and if the enemy dies, gains some magic. This used to be a lot better and can still be okay earlier on in the game. However, overall, it has been rather underwhelming as the game keeps progressing, and despite how useful it used to be, it's definitely going down there. However, it does have some pretty useful traits. Has a magic link to go perfectly into its 10 mana cost. Has some stealthy so it can't be targeted directly, so it can actually build up a little bit of magic, and by a little bit I mean a little bit because that's not a lot. And it also gains some extra magic off its final ability, which isn't a lot, but at least it gets to boost off itself if nothing else, so even if it was the only red, still gets a bit of value. Moneylender has the chance of creating a lot of mana. Can be very situational decent, however there's generally better mana generators out there kind of making them obsolete, but it creates a bunch of red gems boosted by gold, and then it ends up creating a maximum of 14 gems. So for every single gold that you have, every 4 ends up creating 1 gems up to the cap of 14, so you can end up getting a pretty decent amount of gem spawn, and kind of very similar, oddly enough, to the troop that we're just kind of going over, the Mega Varax. Just kind of a different condition, but this one can go up to 15. But yeah, they're both kind of very similar in what they do, just kind of in a different way. Monkey Disciple, you never really use directly onto your team. There is something that can end up summoning it, I believe on the Mythic, so if you're going to have it, you're likely going to have it off of that. But it creates a bunch of red and yellow, and then ends up giving a bunch of allies some life. Generally, if you're going to be using something like this, you'd be better off just with Truffle, or if you want the life, you just go with like Divinia or something else. Overall, it's basically outclassed by everything. Though it does have 75% mana start, so occasionally you can kind of get that quick cast earlier on in the game, but overall, it's just outclassed by too much to really bother with, so I wouldn't really bother with it. As far as the Mushroom Man, he ends up enraging itself and gains some attack boosted by diseased enemies. Nothing you would ever bother with. As far as the Nether Hound, deals damage to an enemy, a first enemy, and hunters mark them. Creates a bunch of purple gems. Can be situationally okay. Overall, it's outclassed by quite a few other mana accumulators out there, but overall, not too bad getting a poke for all that value, as well as the purple spam. Can end up getting a little bit of value. Has the half mana star. It's not completely useless, so definitely towards the lower end. Night Terror is actually a useless one. Just deals some damage to the weakest enemy, and then gains a singular magic. They end up reworking this like 5 years ago, and it was actually almost better before they reworked it, oddly enough, and then made it to what it is now, which is kind of worse. And not by kind of worse, I mean actually is worse. This thing you wouldn't really bother with. Too much random factors. Summons a Dark Storm, or either diseases, freezes, or stuns all enemies. It's too inconsistent. If you need a freeze, it's probably not going to freeze. If you need a stun, it's probably not going to stun. There's just other things that could do each one of those things independently way better at 100% consistency. Nymph, pretty useless. It's kind of just an entangle kind of option. Entangles an enemy, and it eliminates some armor from them. Nothing really too special. If nothing else, it does do it for 6 mana cost, but you have to sacrifice your turn for it. It does have nature link, but overall not too good. So Ogress, this thing is pretty absurd. It's one of the strongest bounty hunter troops in the entire game. It's used for the very meta team that exists right now, Ogress and the T. You know who he is. But he pulls itself to the front, so this is a pretty interesting mechanic for tank because it automatically resets itself even if it gets moved. So let's say a mechanic out there, you put this in first slot and then they move you to the back. Now your tank is all the way in last slot. Well, all you have to do is cast her and she has moved herself back to first slot. I really wish they will add more of these kind of movement options because they can be pretty powerful, especially on tanks like this. But she's one of the few that really has this mechanic. I think there's like a few hero weapons, some other things that kind of have it. However, as far as a troop to have it with how many explosions she does explosions based on her life at a 10-to-1. So if you have something like 110 life right now, that is 11 explosions. So yeah, that's a lot of value that you can end up getting from that. And it's almost like a little mini Gorgulfa. It basically is Gorgulfa, a better version of Gorgulfa in many situations, except it doesn't have to cleanse and is a little bit lower in reduction. Also gets to summon a Fortress State when it dies at 100% chance, as long as it's not stunned. So that's pretty nice because whenever it dies to a lot of skull spam, particularly in something like Guild Wars or PvP-like situation, ends up summoning another tank, and then boom, you're good to go. That tank doesn't have any skull reduction, but does have impervious. So if they're killing you with like triple damage poison or triple damage burning or something similar, well, you're gonna have immune to that because it has impervious. So overall, really solid tank. The fact that this thing is only a rare is pretty insane, and the fact that it's a bounty hunter rare, it's basically just the always going to be your tank in bounty hunter for the rest of forever. The chance that we get a better bounty hunter tank ever is very unlikely, and this is basically just a permanent tank for bounty hunter now. So yeah, pretty amazing troop and among one of the better rares. Owlbear, very underwhelming, just deals some damage to an enemy and just eliminates some attack. Even when the game first started, that thing was still underwhelming, and it hasn't changed. Summons a Dark Storm and decreases a random skill on all enemies by 17. Not really useful because Azura and other similar stat reduction troops just ends up doing it better. Paladin used to be pretty meta. Compared to Rowain these days, not really that useful. It just deals damage to an enemy, boosted by its armor at a 1-to-1. So it can kind of do some one-shots here and there, but compared to Rowain being able to one-shot an entire enemy team, and you get it for free just for completing out Forest of Thorns, you might as well stick with that, making Paladin kind of useless, unfortunately, in the current state of game. Can somewhat be okay in Arena, but beyond that, doesn't really get used. Speaking about things that are kind of useless, but can still be used in Arena, this thing explodes 2 gems and then does some damage. It's kind of like that one bounty troop, except does a little bit more damage, both to the first and last. So it's kind of like Mermaid, but it's mostly just used for Arena. You wouldn't really use outside of it. Speaking of bounty again, this is a silence option, very situational. Used to be used quite a bit more when we didn't have as many bounty troops in the game. However, this thing can still be useful. It deals damage to an enemy and then silences them, and there's a 50% chance to silence adjacent enemies. This means it is potential that it can end up getting 3 silences onto the opposing team, which is the highest amount of silence any rare, I'm pretty sure, can end up doing, as well as one of the highest amount of silence any troop can do, though 2 of those silences are based purely on luck. Though they are 2 individual rolls, each of the two 50% are separate from each other. So to be able to get a triple silence, you would need both of those two 50% to land. It's not just a guarantee if you hit one of them, as they both do roll independently on if it will silence the one above and or below. It could do neither, it could do both, it could do one or the other. As far as Pegasus, nothing really too good. Removes all yellow gems and then deals some damage to the last enemy, boosted by gems removed. Nothing really you would use. And once again, one of those troops that denies its own color, which always seems weird. Feral Hound was one of those troops I was mentioning earlier when I was mentioning the bounty troops, and I just couldn't remember its name. Ends up creating a bunch of red and purple, which is not too bad of a color combination, and ends up burying a random ally. Generally, if you want a barrier within Bounty Hunter, this is what you go for. It's not really that needed, given that the Ogress tank is just so ridiculously tanky that it kind of just does it enough on its own. However, if there ever becomes a point where you kind of need it, or if you have lower stats in general, is worth potentially considering for its barrier spam within Bounty Hunter. Not really going to be used much outside of that context, though, unless you're using a really specific team that needs the red-purple mana accumulation. This thing ends up dealing some true damage to an enemy and then steals some armor that is then shifted into magic. Overall, nothing really too special. It's just a kind of little true damage poke. Many of them exist within the game. Pirate, too situational generally to ever bother using. It gives all allied rogues a bunch of attack, and it gains some gold boosted by allied rogues. Nothing really bother using. It's just basically attack buff that happens to be restricted to only rogues. Pixie ends up fairy firing an enemy and gains an extra turn. Normally not worth it. If this thing was a lower mana cost, it could maybe be okay. If this thing was like a 3, maybe at most 6 mana cost, it could probably get away with occasionally being used. But at an 8 mana cost, it kind of just phases itself out of ever being viable to even the slightest degree. There are so many better things that can end up fairy firing, particularly Queen of Tanya, that you're never really going to bother using this thing just for a single fairy fire. But yeah, it's way too high of a mana cost for what it is. Plains Jumper destroys a bunch of gems and then deals damage to the first enemy. Nothing really too good. Does get a little bit of destroy, however that destroy gem does not scale. If nothing else, it can be good in arena just because since it doesn't scale, it's actually a little bit better in arena just because it's a static number, and things that do scale tend to not be necessarily as good in arena depending on how much lower it is based on magic. But yeah, it can be okay. Nothing else, is mostly just an arena pick. Poison Master, it's outclassed by many other mana accumulators. However, it is a mana accumulator that does have a double poison. That is situationally useful. However, more often than not, it's just kind of useless and not really something you would bother using. Next, we have Possessed Urska. This thing explodes a gem and then deals damage to the first enemy, boosted by purple gems destroyed, and then curses them. It's one of those kind of destroy a gem that has a little bit of potential, but generally isn't used due to all the other destroy a gems that just end up doing a better time. If nothing else, this does have a way of end up curse spamming. If nothing else, it has that little bit of curse that you can end up doing and synergizing that maybe with something else that can end up doing additional damage to the enemy. So kind of has that going for it, but overall there's much better cursors, there's much better single exploders that will end up doing it. A lot of those golem like troops end up doing it quite a bit better as well, as far as applying their 4 times effect off of the explode. This thing ends up dealing damage. Also, Cursed Effigy was the one I was thinking of. I think it's underneath Ultra Rare, though, not under... yeah, it definitely is, because we would have passed it by now. But yeah, Cursed Effigy is basically the better version of that, essentially. So you don't really ever need that, since Cursed Effigy is really easily obtained from the faction. This thing deals damage to an enemy and then is boosted by green gems on the board and then diseases them. Pretty useless, not really something you'd ever bother using. Next we have Ranger. This is really good early on in the game and in arena. It actually had to get nerfed because it was so ridiculously good in early game, and even after a nerf it was still good. It was like buffed and then over buffed too much and then had to get nerfed, and now it's kind of where it is, but still pretty good for early game and arena. Deals damage to an enemy and then 8 damage randomly split amongst everything else, and it's boosted by alive enemies, which obviously if the entire enemy team is alive, well, you're getting 16 additional damage. It's kind of like the other troop like Envy, where it got like the double 16 extra damage, except this gets one singular extra 16 by the fact that they're alive, and doesn't even even if they're damaged, it's fine, unlike Envy. They just simply have to be alive, so that's 16 extra damage if they are, which obviously later in the game is a pitiful amount of damage, though earlier on in the game in arena is a pretty substantial amount of damage. As far as Radagars, he's kind of just there for the random stats effects. He deals damage to 2 random enemies and then flicks a random stats effect to each one of them. Not really anything too good. There's better ways of doing it and not really something you'd bother with. Red Cap deals some true damage to an enemy, and then if the enemy has 100's mark, ends up fairy firing all enemies. This is a rather interesting way of applying fairy fire to all enemies. However, there are so many more consistent ways of doing so, especially the fact that it shares the exact same color with Queen of Tanya, that you're generally not going to be specifically using him for doing so. However, he could be if you want to mess with fairy fire, a good, really low rarity option for, if nothing else. So maybe worth considering in that regard. Plus one of the other troops that you get, the brown-green tank from Wild Court, not that bad either as a early game tank. So if you want to pick those up kind of as early game options, definitely not horrible to do so, though they do fall off later on. Revenant deals damage to an enemy. our last enemy, boosted by skulls, and then death marks them. Overall, nothing really too special, just kind of a standard back poke kind of troop. Death mark can occasionally get lucky, but generally not going to be doing much. This thing cleanses itself, deals some damage to an enemy, and if the enemy dies, gains some attack. Nothing really too interesting. The ones that do magic similarly with true damage are better, like the Miststalker and stuff like that. This thing deals some light splash damage to an enemy, and that's literally it. Light splash damage is being the 25% to adjacents, really bad, never really going to get used. Ridgeback knocks the enemy to the back and then explodes a bunch of gems of one of their mana colors. Can be okay for mana accumulation, though it's mostly just a knocking back option, and not really something you'd normally bother using just compared to better mana accumulators. And he doesn't really have anything following up on his ability other than the fact that he just knocks it to the back, which is kind of just his whole gimmick. Next, we have the Rift Links. This does some true damage to an enemy, and then knocks them to last position. This is also similarly useless. However, the main benefit of this is a Bounty Hunter troop, so occasionally it can be used because of its synergy with the Big T Bounty Hunter troop. But aside from that, it's not really going to be used for anything other than Bounty Hunter in order to synergize it with the one. But anyways, as far as this next one, the Rock Squid, it removes a bunch of gems from of the most used enemy mana color. This was a mechanic that came in through one of the factions. Most used is kind of weird as far as how it ends up functioning. It ends up then gaining some armor for each gem removed at an extremely pitiful amount for something like a Delve. Overall, very underwhelming, not something you would ever bother using. Next up, we have Sabertooth Tiger. Ends up gaining magic whenever it gets a kill. This could be good in arena. Outside of arena, it is basically never going to be used. Here's another one of those things that can only ever be casted once and is very bad. It just gains a bunch of life and armor. Even that common that we saw earlier that ends up gaining a bunch of life and attack. The rock can end up being quite a bit better than what this thing can do, because at least life and attack allows it to still be offensive. Plus, it does it for 15 mana cost. This thing is one higher and doesn't even do attack. If this was life, attack, and armor, it would still be useless though. But yeah, it doesn't really get to do much, and just kind of underwhelming. Savage Hunter. So this thing is one of the best rares in the game. He is pretty insane. The fact that this is even considered a rare. This is one of those Knoll troops. There is a thing that can summon random Knoll troops. It doesn't notify that it is a Knoll troop. However, it is a Knoll troop under that classification of troop. These things do the triple damage to a certain color, in this case green. However, it has a very insane amount of traits set up here. It does double damage off a Hunter's Mark. It does double damage if they are green. And it has Enrage. All three of these stack. So it does 6 times skull damage to any green that does not have immune to Hunter's Mark. That is an insanely high amount of damage. Not only that, but because it's Enrage, he also hits through all traits, so even if they have like a 75% score reduction or 50% score reduction, actually there's no green that has 75%, but if they have like 50% score reduction or something similar, this will just hit right through and just kill them, even if they have Agile, 50% reduction, anything like that. Yeah, it is absolutely insane how much damage this thing has. You've probably seen it a lot on Green Guild War Day. It is really, really viable for how low of a rarity it is. It's actually one of the best damage sources, I believe, under the entirety of rares, though only when you're specifically up against green. Basically just one-shots anything it touches if it's up against a pure green team, which of course, Green Guild War defends. The entire enemy team will be green. So that thing is very, very strong. Highly advised if you don't have it set for your Green Guild War defend. Definitely something to consider. Oddly enough, I don't think I have it set currently to mine. However, it's not necessarily required. Obviously, 1 Entangle and he's doing 0. So there are ways to counter it, obviously, as that's definitely very hard countered by a Entangle there. But anyways, still really good. This thing deals some damage and then creates a bunch of purple. It's a bounty troop, however, it's just not really that viable. It just doesn't create enough purple to really bother using. Plus, there's not enough good bounty troops that even use purple mana to begin with, at least currently. This thing just steals a bunch of attack from an enemy and then shifts it to armor and then barriers all wild folk allies. Not really something you'd really bother using, and it is forced to have to be used on wild folk and already makes it even weaker. And even if it wasn't restricted to only wild folk, would probably be very situational when you actually bring it out. As far as Siren, does some damage to an enemy and then creates a bunch of color of their mana. This has kind of gotten phased out ever since Leprechaun existed. However, it is Empower that can do damage on turn 1 while also mana accumulating on turn 1. However, in like 99.9% of situations, if not more, at least 99.5, maybe more, you would end up using Leprechaun instead of Siren if you want a similar effect. So overall, Siren unfortunately has kind of got phased out of the game due to the existence of Leprechaun. As far as Sister of Nightmares, ends up dealing damage to last 2 enemies and then inflicts a random status effect to them and then poisons them. Overall, not too bad. The double tap ends up doing a nice amount of additional side effects. Not really something you would use for the most part, but it has a nice quick 75% mana start kind of thing. Has stealthy, so it has a lot of things to make it like not useless, but it just doesn't scale too well later into the game. If you're just progressing through the game and you just end up picking up something like this, it's not horrible, but it definitely falls off the later you go. So do be mindful of that. Like pre level 500, it can definitely get some usage. So Sister Superior, pretty interesting option. There's quite a few things that this can end up being used for. It is only 6 mana costs, and it ends up cleansing all allies with Empower. So this is one of the most spammable cleanses in the entire game. There are still quite a few that are generally more viable, like Apothecary and such, but there are some interesting team compositions where this is used, particularly Guild War Defend teams, because you get to counter that Entangle, or counter that Freeze, or counter whatever kind of thing they might be doing to try to counter your counter. So you basically counter the counter of the counter when you're doing the Guild War thing. But yeah, also gets to dispel and stun all daemon and undead if they happen to be using any. But the most relevant thing on top of all this, gain an extra turn automatically. This makes it so the AI basically can never mess this up unless they just immediately cast her for no reason whatsoever. But it basically ensures that whatever team you're using on defend will be cleansed on the turn that it decides to act, assuming the AI will actually decide to cleanse, which normally it will. But it essentially ensures your team will be pure, not frozen, not entangled, not anything when it does its turn 1. The main gimmick for this is you end up having this thing cleanse. You have some kind of other empower in the team that converts a gem that then goes super crazy into whatever it feeds mana into, and then you kind of auto win off of that. So pretty nice. It's also a great alternative for greed when you're doing like the greed, or when you're using a Sister Superior, Dust Devil, Double Iron Hawk, as it doesn't have any of that extra delay. Though it does get a little bit extra delay off of the random stat there, though. Nowhere near compared to an explosion off of greed. But overall, really viable rare, and it's a bounty troop, though you don't really use in bounty. It's pretty much unused in bounty, however, it is really good outside of bounty, oddly enough. One of those few instances where a troop, actually it might be the only instance, where a troop is bad in bounty hunter, but good outside of bounty hunter, which is kind of interesting. Next is Slayer Ghost. Oh, this was the troop I was thinking of earlier when I was thinking of the Dwarven thing. The Slayer Ghost ends up dealing damage to the weakest enemy, and then transforms all skulls to Doom Skulls. This is extremely situational and not something you would just use for the sake of using. However, there are some troops in the game that have boost ratio based on how many Doom Skulls are on the board, most notably in Rage Carandera. However, there are a few others here and there that can also end up doing it, and that's pretty much its main synergy, is to get boost ratio off of anything that has a really good Doom Skull boost ratio mechanic. Very situational one, you would use it almost never. However, it's a utility troop used entirely for that purpose, and you would never use it for any other purpose other than that purpose, because obviously the enemy can also take use of those Doom Skulls, and the fact that you don't get an automatic extra turn or anything like that, or even any ability to extra turn, makes it so the enemy has a really good chance to just use all of those Doom Skulls against you. However, there are some really rare situations where it can be usable, if nothing else. This thing freezes an enemy and then creates a bunch of blue gems boosted by frozen enemies. Nothing really too good here, though it can end up creating a okay amount of blue gems, if nothing else. 10 mana cost actually ends up making it, actually it isn't too bad. It's if you can get the entire enemy team frozen, it can end up being a pretty decent blue mana accumulator. I don't feel like I ever bother using this for such, even though, yeah, it's actually not too bad now that I'm looking at it. It's stealthy, has half mana start, has kind of everything it needs to not be horrible. I think the biggest issue is there isn't really a good enough blue troop to feed back into it necessarily, while having the 4x freeze, though this thing actually could get incorporated into some teams into the future, because the 6 blue boosted by each frozen, that's a total of 18 blues. So that's not a small number, starting with 5 mana cost, so never mind. This thing actually is somewhat decent. I haven't actually bothered really using this, but it definitely could become usable. If we ever get like a good, or even just a single 4x freeze option, I could see this being useful, because whatever it gets 4x freeze, there's no way it doesn't use blue. So if that thing can mana accumulate into it, and then this mana accumulates back, could definitely have some purpose into the future. Overall, I'm not aware of anything that's too broken with it, but it definitely has potential to be broken in the future. So overall, actually not that bad. Next up, Soldier of Wraith. Ends up dealing some true damage to an enemy, boosted by red gems. Pretty bad. Overall, not really something you'd bother using. However, at least it can be used for Bounty Hunter, so there's that. In the context of Bounty Hunter, it's not as bad. However, there are better true damage options, of course. We'll be getting to them soon. and Bounty Hunter. This thing used to be a lot better. It does have Empower. It gives a little bit of board control on turn 1. Takes a while to figure out where you want to use it though, so it's generally not really viable to use due to how slow it is compared to other options. But it gets to choose a purple gem and then destroys a row and column, and then gives it 1 magic to all other allies. Unfortunately, that is only 1 magic. It's not scaled on anything. If that was like based on half its magic or 1/4 its magic, it could be a little bit viable as far as how much magic gain he does. However, it's a static 1, so it's pretty bad. As far as Spellblade, it ends up dealing damage to an enemy, and then it's boosted by enchanted allies, and then a random ally. Overall, not too good. It's 5 times boost ratio, just too hard to really bother building a team around. Even in arena, you're generally not going to be, though at least it can do at least somewhat okay in arena with that boost ratio, though there's generally better options, but could be an okay damage source otherwise, but you wouldn't really use it outside of arena. So Stargaze is a bit of a weird one. I don't feel like it's used much in the current state of the game. However, it's not horrible. Used to be used quite a bit more back in the day. It removes all blue gems and then gives, mostly when Justice Team was really strong, because you needed a way to counter blue. But it removes all blue gems and then gives a bunch of attack to an ally, boosted by gems removed. It basically has no boost ratio of relevance. However, this is a good way to give a turn 1 attack gain to your first ally, and is also a good way to counter up blue if you're just looking to do so if the enemy team is using a lot of it. Current state of the game is not really that viable compared to other converters that can do so at the beginning of battle. However, it's a way to gain attack if nothing else, and a nice little flash attack gain if nothing. It can at least do that. This thing basically is a standard scatter, not really any point in using this. This is one of the things in an earlier kingdom that just has the very bare bones ability of it, so nothing you'd really bother using. Though I believe in the context of arena, its base value actually isn't too bad, so it can somewhat kind of work there, but outside of that context, not really used. Street Thief steals all enemy gold, which ever so occasionally can be viable if you're up against like a gold team that specifically needs its gold for boost ratio. That's very rare in the current state of game, though it does still happen. You could use this to hard counter that, as it ends up creating a bunch of gems based on it. It creates 6 purple gems, boosted by gold stolen to a maximum of 16, so you can end up getting quite a lot of purple gem just by doing that. Unfortunately, it doesn't feed back into itself, but still a lot of mana accumulation nonetheless. So next is Succubus. Nothing too interesting. Does have a full mana drain, generally. Depending on your magic, it could be less than full mana, but normally it will be full mana, since nothing's... actually, there is something that technically has a 50 mana cost, so that's not true. There is actually something that it wouldn't be able to full mana drain, but of course, depending on its magic is how much it drains. Unfortunately, it's not just a full drain, meaning if it was webbed, it would drain almost nothing at all from an enemy, and then death marks them. Overall, pretty bad. Not really something you'd bother using. If you randomly get off a summon, it could be okay for your team and kind of save you. Otherwise, you would never specifically use it on your team. Summer Knights, it destroys a row, gains a bunch of armor and attack, and then boosted by red at 2 times. Really good in arena and gains barrier. Outside of arena, you're not really going to be using this. There's much better tanks out there, but inside the context of arena, it is among one of the better tanks, so there's at least that going for it, because it gains durability and offense while also having that little bit of board control while also mana accumulating. So there's quite a few things going for it, but it's not really something you would use outside of arena. This thing gives a bunch of life to all allies, and this summons a Bone Daemon. It used to have a different summon back in the day. I think it was a Ghoul, if not mistaken. However, they ended up changing it to a Bone Daemon, and overall pretty bad. Its magic, its life gain isn't even based on its magic, so it doesn't even have that going for it. Overall, pretty bad, and not really something you'd ever bother using. Swordmaster deals damage to an enemy, the first enemy, boosted by the enemy's mana cost. So this will do the mana cost, not the mana they currently have. So even if they don't currently have full mana, it will still hit for their full amount. This can be situationally good in arena, however, not really used in any other situation, because if they're using something that has like a 16 mana cost, well, you're going to be hitting for 16 additional damage plus whatever else it's already going to be doing, basically one-shotting. However, outside that context, it's not really used. As far as Templar, I actually use this for one of my Guild War teams currently. It's definitely a bit of an off-meta troop. Definitely used to be a little bit better in the past. However, has a water link going into it, so you don't need to give it a banner, which is nice. It's not required since it already has its link attached to it itself. It gives all other allies a bunch of armor and then transforms all red to green. This can be good against Yagwe Queen Titania team if nothing else, because that team absolutely loves spamming their red, and it can be a good hard counter to this. You could feed into something that uses a lot of green like Wild Queen or something similar. Overall, pretty bad troop. However, I actually do use it on occasion, even though it's pretty off meta. But every single troop that has like a little amount of board control is theoretically usable. Anything that just like does something with like no follow-up, like let's say like this, is generally going to fall off completely. But anything that has any amount of capability of touching the board can actually be used. It might not be as good as other options that exist, but just the capability of having control over the board can go a very long ways. So even things that are just like really simple like this, it might not seem like much, but it can get its value here and there, so they're not completely useless. When they don't touch the board at all, they kind of are, because they're automatically ending their turn without claiming any additional value for themselves. But definitely look out for anything that can even remotely touch the board in any way that has control, that you know for sure what it's going to do. Because when you know exactly what it's going to do, you'll get occasional instances where you can end up utilizing it. Though generally weaker than other options that can be used. Anyways, as far as a thermometer? Thermometer. Wait, is that actually thermometer? Thermometer? I'm just gonna call it thermometer. Anyways, thermometer. Deal. No, that's not what it says though. Deal damage to all purple enemies, and then drains some mana from them. Overall, pretty horrible. Only attacks purples. Not really anything useful. Just way too situational. Even in a pure color, if you're up against like a pure purple team, it's still even situational. Then the devoted ends up creating some gems of a chosen color and then cleanses all allies and gives them some armor. It's okay. It has the ability to loop ever so slightly, though it's a pretty low amount of gem spawn. The fact that it has cleanse is its main saving grace, though its traits are pretty underwhelming and generally is not a troop that's going to get used. So, we finally got to him, although I'm pretty sure all of you already knew who he was. Takaraki Warrior. So, this thing is the absolute best bounty hunter troop in the entire game. Outside of Bounty Hunter, not the greatest, so it can still be used. He can still be used in Arena. He can still be used outside of Arena in normal battles if you want. If you're earlier on in the game and you kind of need a true damage option. This thing is absolutely insane. It deals true damage to an enemy boosted by their armor. So this actually ends up gaining quite a bit of a benefit from the enemy having higher stats because their armor isn't going to move. So you still keep getting that full boost ratio even after the second hit, the third hit, the fourth hit, though they're generally going to be dead by then unless you have a really low amount of damage. But yeah, you can get a lot of boost ratio from that. If they have 90 armor, that's 30 additional true damage, and that keeps stacking regardless of how high their armor gets. And that's on every single hit you do as long as you don't take away their armor. So yeah, has a lot of potential, really insane in Bounty Hunter. And basically every Bounty Hunter team for the last like year or two has basically been built entirely around the premise of Takaraki. So yeah, he's very strong for that, if nothing else. But it can be used in pretty much any standard kind of true damage team. Obviously, there's things like Beatrix and other viable options that outclass him later in the game. But then again, Beatrix is even that hard to get. But still, pretty decent option nonetheless. Anyways, as far as this thing, creates a bunch of gems of a chosen color and then barriers all war gears. 2 situational, you never really bother using it. Trickster explodes a bunch of gems and then switches to first and last enemy. This is very situationally worth it, though given that he shares the exact same coloration as Leprechaun, it is normally just more viable to run Leprechaun instead, and you'd almost never really run Trickster. As far as the Undead Drake, ends up exploding some gems and conjures a Bone Storm, not really that viable, though it would allow you to refresh the board with potentially more skulls than what was already there, since the Skull Storm would be active for the explosion. Our Skia Druid is a bounty hunter troop that can have some potential, though it doesn't synergize too well with the current Takaraki builds, but it does have some usage outside of it as well. It gets to entangle an enemy and then creates a bunch of green boosted by entangled enemies, and it can end up getting a total of 18 spawn. So it can end up spawning 18 green gems if the entire enemy team is entangled. It's obviously very situational, but does have a lot of potential and can even do the refresh on it. It's kind of like that one Frozen Troop we just saw earlier, except it does it for entangle. So definitely has some potential moving forward. However, in the current state of the game, doesn't really have anything too viable that ends up getting used for, but definitely something to keep an eye on, as this thing definitely has potential, especially with his elemental, since you can do it with a Mirage Queen and then have the Mirage Queen convert all the greens into Doom Skulls and get some really good synergy there. Though I'm not aware of anything in the current state of the game that's particularly meta with it, though it definitely has potential moving forward as more options come into the game. As far as the next one here, gains a bunch of life and attack boosted by red gems, and then enrages itself. Outside of Arena, you'd never really bother touching this thing. There's just better options out there. Valkyrie you end up using as a mana accumulator, also ends up creating a bunch of blue gems as well as doing souls. So this at one point was actually the only soul gainer in the entire game, which was pretty cool. Way back when the game started, like almost 7 years ago, 6.5 years ago. There was one point where this was basically the only viable way to gain souls. There was a few other things that could gain souls, like Avena, that gained like 1 soul at a time, but this was the only thing that could like mass gain you souls for like a year and a half. It was pretty insane. Basically every team had to be using Valkyrie, and it was used for the Justice team as well, where Justice was ultra meta. You would use Queen Mab, you'd use Valkyrie, one other option, you're pretty much good to go. In the current state of the game, it's not used too often, but as you're progressing through the game, it could be a good mana accumulator to make sure you passively get a bunch of souls as you're going through all the quest lines. One other pretty good synergy that it has is you get Rowan for free from completing a 4 Forest of Thorns, so you can use Valkyrie with it in order to feed it mana while also gaining basically your free insta-kill off of Romaine, while also gaining souls, so it has that viability. It also has Water Link, so it gains even more mana for the blues that it does do. Vampire Lord, nothing too interesting, is pretty good in Arena, but outside that context isn't really going to get used. Removes all reds and then deals some true damage to an enemy, boosted by gems removed, and also gets to gain some life, so it doesn't get to gain how much true damage does as life. There are some things that do that, as well as that one rare that we mentioned earlier, that's that 65% score reduction. Unfortunately, he's not one of them. He also doesn't have that score reduction, so generally he's outclassed by quite a few other things, including other rares. So as far as War Elephant, he ends up gaining a bunch of life and 2 magic to all allies below him, and it creates a bunch of skulls. You'd basically never use this in any situation other than for Arena. It is a bounty hunter troop, though you wouldn't really bother with it in bounty, just simply for Arena. As far as Werewolf, it explodes a gem, creates a bunch of red gems, and is boosted by skulls. Overall, this can be good in some bounty hunter builds, particularly because of how much red you can end up getting down onto the board in order to defeat Takaraki and other similar things. However, outside of that context, it can be okay. You're generally going to get like, what, 3 skulls, so that's a 14, or sorry, no, it's a 4 base, so it's actually going to be 9, so it can do 13 reds when it ends up destroying 3 skulls, so not a horrible amount. It's just very situational when you would end up using it compared to other mana accumulators that already exist, but it's not a horrible option. Warhound is a pretty horrible option, just eliminates some attack based on half its magic, and from the first enemy, and then explodes 2 gems. Wait, yes, explode 2 gems? When did that happen? I do not recall it ever having explode 2 gems, but apparently it does. Anyways, I used to always think I just did the attack reduction. I have no clue when I got that explode. It ends up, next one is Warlock. This is actually the cheapest to obtain necromancy troop in the entire game, so this is pretty noteworthy. It's only a rare that has necromancy on the very first perk, so if you're struggling to find anything that has necromancy and you kind of want to build a build around it, doing this with Valkyrie used to be pretty viable. Now that Nomapalooza is kind of like a billion times better for farming, to the point where you don't really need a soul farm anymore. Not sure if it's really that viable now, but Valkyrie with Warlock, definitely a combination that has seen a lot of play in the past when first starting off, and in the current state of the game still isn't bad either for doing such. However, they both fall off the later you get, particularly Warlock falls off very hard. Even in Arena, he doesn't end up doing too much, so he can still be an okay damage pick for Arena. The Watch Mother is mostly just used for the pure faction. You wouldn't really use it outside of anything other than its pure faction. Just gives a bunch of life, boosted by green gems, and then has either chance of summoning a Clarion Leech or just a standard of Clarion. Clarion's not too bad, or sorry, Clarion Leech isn't too bad of a summon. Clarion's kind of weird overall, because the main reason why you end up using a Clarion in the pure faction is to counter the enemies of Clarion, not necessarily because it's actually good. But overall, not that good. It's pretty much just used for pure faction and nothing else. The pure faction for all seeing eye. Next, we have the Werebird. As far as the Werebird, ends up dealing some damage to an enemy, boosted by red gems, and there's a 15% chance it transforms into Turban. That's something mechanic-wise that pretty much everything in that faction has. Turban's a thing that has a double convert. So overall, that summon isn't too bad when it transforms into it. Overall, its ability isn't really too good, though, so it can be good in Arena, if nothing else, because you get a nice double convert or legend when it does end up transforming into it. But beyond that, it isn't really going to get much usage, and even in Arena, it's not the greatest of picks. So White does get to steal life. This is one of those other options I was mentioning that's better than Vampire Lord, because by steal life, that does mean it gets to accumulate that life, so whatever damage it does, it gets to also get for itself. So 36 damage means it would also gain 36 life in this particular instance. Also gets to create 5 purple, which is a pretty pitiful amount. However, it does get to gain souls based on the exact same amount of what its damage is, and even if it doesn't do the full amount of damage, it still gains the full amount of souls, assuming you haven't already hit the 40 cap. But yeah, nice little soul gainer. Very situational when you'd bring it out. However, it's more so like an early game true damage poke. Definitely generally better than using Banshee in most situations, unless you really need that gem blue to red convert that it has. But overall, not too bad. It falls off later into the game, but as you're progressing through the game, can definitely be a potentially viable option. Next, we have Winter Knight. Ends up exploding a gem, gains a bunch of armor, and then gains barrier. Wait, does it not gain barrier? Yeah, and then gains barrier. Overall, nothing really too special. That other Summer Night thing we were mentioning earlier, that red-yellow, ends up gaining attack and doing a pretty similar thing with its row destroy, so this isn't really that useful in comparison to it. So overall, it's just kind of outclassed by another rare that already exists. Wolf Knights can be okay for like an early game kind of pick-off troop. It does some true damage, and if the enemy already has any amount of life missing, it'll do 6 additional damage. Overall, nothing too good, but it can be used in Arena, if nothing else, for a nice one-shot true damage, assuming they already have damage, particularly if you could apply easily off of poison. Has really good synergy with poison and bleed, where that will end up doing damage to them, and then you wipe it out with a Wolf Knight for the one-shot off of 8 mana cost. So so not too bad in that context. However, in most other contexts, isn't really going to get used. And as far as the wood Rhine X, it converts all red gems to green gems, and then deals some splash damage to an enemy, boosted by green gems. And overall, another one that's kind of just useless, small damage sources. A lot of the better damage sources are, of course, on all of the higher rarity stuff. The main things that lower rarity stuff get to do, of course, are mana accumulation. A lot of really good mana accumulators in the lower ends. Definitely lots that are worth considering. It's also why I normally mention it is better to get all of the damage source mythics first, rather than the mana accumulating mythics, because there's so many good low rarity troops that mana accumulate just as good, if not better, than high rarity troops. So definitely keep an eye out on lower rarity stuff. Just because it's lower rarity doesn't necessarily mean it's worse. Anyways, guys, if you still have any other questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. Looks like we got it to about an hour and a half this time around. But we'll keep going. We'll do it for all the ultra rares, all the epics, all the legends, all the mythics, as well as including the boss ones with the mythics. But anyways, guys, I'll wrap it up for now. Any other questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. These videos will be going up 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time every single day until we have covered every single one. I'll catch you guys when I get back from break. Thank you so much for watching. Bye, everyone.